The black waitress helps a drunk billionaire get home. 1 week later, she becomes the hotel owner. The night was heavy in Detroit, the kind of night where the air clung to your skin like a warning. The streets of this forgotten corner of the city were quiet, but not the peaceful kind of quiet. It was the silence of a place holding its breath, waiting for something to break. Sodium streetlights flickered above cracked sidewalks, casting jagged shadows that danced like ghosts. A stray dog nosed through an overturned trash can, its claws clicking against the pavement. Then, out of nowhere, a sound shattered the stillness. A gunshot, sharp and final, ripping through the darkness like a scream. In a narrow alley behind a shuttered pawn shop, Elliot Grayson stumbled forward, his polished shoes scraping against the gravel. His tailored suit, once crisp and commanding, hung in tatters, the navy fabric stained dark with blood. A bullet had torn through his shoulder, and each step sent a jolt of pain that blurred his vision. His breath came in ragged gasps, fogging in the cold March air. He clutched the edge of a dumpster for balance, but his fingers slipped, slick with sweat and blood. His knees buckled, and he collapsed hard, his body crumpling beside a pile of soggy cardboard. The streetlight above caught his face, pale, sharp-featured, with gray-flecked hair plastered to his forehead. His eyes, wide with panic, darted toward the mouth of the alley. He wasn't alone. Two figures emerged from the shadows across the street, their hooded jackets blending into the night. They moved with the lazy confidence of predators who knew their prey was already down. One of them, taller, with a scar cutting across his jaw, nudged the other and pointed at Elliot. A low chuckle passed between them, cold and deliberate. The scarred man reached into his pocket, his fingers brushing the handle of a knife. They didn't rush. They didn't need to. The alley was a dead end, and Elliot was bleeding out. To them, he was just another mark, a rich man who'd wandered into the wrong part of town at the wrong time. They stepped closer, their boots crunching on broken glass, their eyes glinting with something darker than greed. Elliot's hand fumbled in his pocket, searching for his phone, but it was gone, lost in the chaos of whatever had led him here. His vision swam, the edges darkening, but he forced himself to focus. He wasn't ready to die. Not like this. Not in a place where no one would find him until morning. He tried to push himself up, but his strength was fading, the blood pooling beneath him, warm against the cold ground. A distant siren wailed, too far to matter. The figures were closer now, maybe 20 feet away, their shadows stretching long and menacing across the alley walls. Elliot's lips moved, a whispered plea to no one. Please, someone. Across the street, the neon sign of the Rusty Anchor flickered, its faded letters barely glowing against the peeling facade of the old hotel. The front door creaked open, and Lila Carter stepped out, pulling her worn denim jacket tight against the chill. Her shift had ended 10 minutes ago, but she'd stayed late to help Tasha count the night's tips, barely enough to cover her bus fare home. Lila was 25, with sharp brown eyes and a braid that swung as she moved. She carried the weight of too many responsibilities, her sick brother, a stack of medical bills, a life that never quite gave her a break. But there was a fire in her, a stubborn refusal to let the world grind her down. She was halfway to the bus stop when the gunshot stopped her cold. Her heart lurched, instinct screaming at her to keep walking, to stay out of trouble. Detroit wasn't kind to heroes, but then she heard it, a low, pained groan from the alley across the street. Against every ounce of better judgment, Lila turned toward the sound. She saw Elliot's crumpled form, the blood glinting under the streetlight, and the two hooded figures closing in like vultures. Her breath caught, fear clawing at her chest. She could walk away. No one would know, but something in her wouldn't let her move. "Hey!" Lila's voice cut through the night, louder than she meant it to be. The figures froze, their heads snapping toward her. The scarred man's eyes narrowed, his hand tightening on the knife. Lila's pulse hammered, but she didn't back down. She stepped off the curb, her sneakers splashing through a puddle, and ran toward the alley. "Get away from him!" she shouted, her voice trembling but fierce. The men hesitated, sizing her up. A lone woman, no weapon, no backup. They laughed, a sound that sent a shiver down her spine, and took another step toward Elliot. Lila didn't think. She didn't have time to. She sprinted to Elliot's side, dropping to her knees beside him. Up close, she could see the pain etched into his face, the blood soaking his shirt. "Stay with me, sir," she said, her hands shaking as she pressed her scarf against his wound. His eyes fluttered, meeting hers for a fleeting moment, and she saw something there. Gratitude, maybe, or just raw fear. The men were closer now, their shadows looming. Lila glanced up, her jaw tight. "Not tonight," she muttered under her breath, her voice a mix of defiance and desperation. With a strength she didn't know she had, Lila hooked her arms under Elliot's and pulled. He was heavy, dead weight, but adrenaline surged through her. She dragged him toward the alley's far end, where a rusted fire escape led to the back door of the Rusty Anchor. The men shouted something, their footsteps quickening, but Lila didn't look back. She kicked the door open, the hinges screaming, and hauled Elliot inside just as the scarred man's hand grazed the frame. The door slammed shut, and she fumbled with the lock, her fingers slick with sweat. Outside, the men cursed, their voices muffled but angry. Inside, the dim hallway of the Rusty Anchor buzzed with flickering fluorescent lights, and Elliot's blood left a trail on the chipped tile floor. Lila sank to her knees, her breath coming in sharp bursts. Elliot groaned, his head lolling to one side. She didn't know who he was or why he'd been shot, but she knew one thing. She'd just stepped into something bigger than herself. And in that moment, with the world pressing in from all sides, Lila Carter made a choice that would change everything. The door to the Rusty Anchor slammed shut with a metallic clang, sealing out the cold Detroit night and the two shadowed figures chasing their prey. Inside, the hallway was a dim maze of peeling paint and buzzing fluorescent lights, casting a sickly yellow glow on the chipped tile floor. Lila Carter's heart pounded like a drum in her chest, her breaths coming fast and shallow. She knelt beside Elliot Grayson, the stranger she'd just dragged from the jaws of death. His blood-soaked suit left a dark smear on the tiles, and his face was pale, almost ghostly under the flickering light. The bullet wound in his shoulder oozed, staining the scarf she'd pressed against it. Outside, the men's voices snarled through the door, their fists pounding once, twice, then falling silent. They were still out there, waiting, but Lila didn't have time to think about them. "Not now." "Stay with me, sir," she said, her voice low but firm. The kind of tone she used when her little brother, Jamal, had a fever that wouldn't break. She was only 25, but life had already taught her how to keep panic at bay. Her hands trembled as she adjusted the scarf, trying to slow the bleeding. Elliot's eyes fluttered open, glassy and unfocused, but he was alive. That was enough for now. Lila glanced at the door, her jaw tight. The lock was old, rusted. She wasn't sure it would hold if those men decided to force their way in. She needed to move, and fast. "Lila, what the hell's going on?" Tasha's voice cut through the haze, sharp and worried. The receptionist stood at the end of the hallway, her braids swinging as she hurried toward them. Her eyes widened when she saw Elliot, then flicked to the blood on Lila's hands. "Is that... Oh my God, is he shot?" "No time to explain," Lila snapped, her tone sharper than she meant. "Help me get him to the break room." "And grab the first aid kit." Tasha hesitated for a split second, then nodded and darted off, her sneakers squeaking on the tiles. Lila turned back to Elliot, her mind racing. The break room was just down the hall, tucked behind the front desk. It wasn't much, a sagging couch, a microwave that smelled of burnt popcorn, but it was safer than this exposed hallway. She hooked her arms under Elliot's shoulders again, ignoring the ache in her own. "Come on, you're not dying on my watch," she muttered, half to him, half to herself. He was heavy, his body limp except for the occasional groan. Lila's sneakers slipped on the floor, but she gritted her teeth and pulled, her braids swinging with each step. The hallway seemed to stretch forever, the lights flickering like they were mocking her. She could still hear the men outside, their voices faint now, but the threat lingered like smoke. Her mind flashed to Jamal, waiting at home with their neighbor, Ms. Rosa. If she didn't make it back tonight, no. She shoved the thought away. She'd make it. She always did. They reached the break room just as Tasha burst in with the first aid kit, a battered metal box that looked older than the hotel itself. "Lila, you're crazy," Tasha said, breathless, but she was already ripping open the kit, pulling out gauze and tape. "You don't even know this guy. What if those dudes come after you?" "Then they'll have to catch me first," Lila said, her voice steady despite the fear gnawing at her. She knelt beside Elliot, now slumped on the couch, and started cleaning the wound as best she could. The bullet had gone clean through, a small mercy, but he'd lost too much blood. "Call 911, Tasha. Tell them we need an ambulance. Now." Tasha fumbled for her phone, her fingers shaking as she dialed. Lila focused on Elliot, her hands moving with a calm she didn't feel. "Hey, sir, you hear me?" she said, leaning close. "You're gonna be okay?" "Just hang on." His lips moved, but no sound came out. His hand twitched, brushing against hers, and for a moment their eyes locked. There was something in his gaze, gratitude maybe, or a plea. It hit Lila like a punch, reminding her of the nights she'd sat by Jamal's hospital bed, willing him to keep fighting. "Lila, what if those guys are still out there?" Tasha whispered, her phone pressed to her ear. "You ran straight at them." "You could have... I didn't think." Lila cut her off, her voice softer now. I couldn't leave him." She didn't say the rest, that she'd seen too many people turn away in this city, too many lives lost because no one cared enough to act. She wasn't going to be one of them. Not tonight. The distant wail of sirens broke the tension, growing louder by the second. Lila let out a breath she hadn't realized she was holding. Help was coming, but as she looked at Elliot, his blood on her hands, she knew this wasn't over. She'd stepped into something bigger, something dangerous. And in the quiet of that dingy break room, with the weight of her choice settling over her, Lila Carter felt the spark of something new, a fire that wouldn't let her walk away. The break room of the Rusty Anchor smelled of stale coffee and burnt popcorn, its dim light barely holding back the shadows. Lila Carter knelt beside the sagging couch where Elliot Grayson lay, his blood-soaked suit a stark contrast to the faded cushions. The scarf she'd pressed against his shoulder was now a sodden mess, but it had slowed the bleeding, just enough to keep him alive. Her hands were steady, but her heart raced, the weight of what she'd done crashing over her like a wave. Outside, the sirens grew louder, their wail cutting through the Detroit night. Help was close, but time was slipping away. Tasha stood by the door, her phone still clutched tight, her eyes darting between Lila and the stranger they'd dragged from death's doorstep. "Lila, the ambulance is 2 minutes out," Tasha said, her voice tight with worry. "But seriously, who is this guy? You risked your life for him." Lila didn't answer right away. Her focus was on Elliot, his chest rising and falling in shallow, uneven breaths. His face was pale, etched with pain, but there was something refined about him, his sharp jawline, the silver flecks in his hair. He didn't belong here, not in this rundown corner of the city where hope was as scarce as the streetlights that worked. "I need to know if he's got family," Lila said, her voice low but firm. She reached for his jacket, hesitating for a moment before slipping her hand into the inner pocket. Her fingers brushed against leather, a wallet thick and heavy. She pulled it out, ignoring Tasha's raised eyebrow. "I'm not stealing," Lila snapped, more to herself than to Tasha. "I just need a name." She flipped the wallet open, her breath catching as she saw the contents. A driver's license, a stack of crisp $100 bills, and a gold-trimmed business card that gleamed even in the dim light. She held the card up, squinting to read the embossed text. Elliot Grayson, CEO, Grayson Enterprises. Tasha leaned over, her eyes widening. Grayson Enterprises... Wait, that's the guy building the new downtown mall. The Billionaire. Her voice rose, a mix of shock and disbelief. "Lila, you just saved a freaking billionaire!" Lila froze, the card trembling in her hand. A billionaire? Here, bleeding out in a grimy hotel break room? It didn't make sense. She looked at Elliot, his face now slack, his lips parting in a faint groan. Billionaires didn't end up shot in Detroit alleys, not unless something had gone terribly wrong. "Doesn't matter who he is," Lila said, shoving the card back into the wallet. "He's a person, and he's hurt." But her mind was spinning. She glanced at the wallet again, noticing a small photo tucked behind the license. A young girl, maybe 10, with Elliot's sharp features and a bright smile. Lila's chest tightened. She thought of her brother, Jamal, his hospital bed, his quiet courage. Whoever this man was, he had someone waiting for him, someone who'd be devastated if he didn't make it. "Lila, you're not listening," Tasha said, pacing now. "This guy's loaded. What if those dudes outside were after him for a reason? You could be in deep trouble." Lila shook her head, her jaw tight. "I didn't save him for money, Tasha. and I'm not leaving him to bleed out because of what ifs. She grabbed the first aid kit, pulling out fresh gauze to replace the soaked scarf. Her hands moved with purpose, but her thoughts were a storm. A billionaire. The word felt foreign, like it belonged to another world, not this one of cracked tiles and flickering lights. Elliot stirred, his eyes fluttering open for a moment. "Thank you," he rasped, his voice barely audible. Lila leaned closer, her voice soft but urgent. "Just hold on, okay?" "Help's coming." His hand twitched, brushing against hers, and she felt a pang of something she couldn't name. Connection, maybe, or the weight of a life in her hands. She didn't know his story, but she knew pain, and she knew what it meant to fight for someone who couldn't fight for themselves. Tasha's phone buzzed, snapping Lila back to the moment. "Ambulance is here," Tasha said, rushing to the door. "But Lila, we can't just hand him over to some random driver. What if they rob him?" "His wallet's got more cash than we make in a year." Lila nodded, her decision already made. "No Uber, no risks. I'll call a taxi and pay for it myself." "He's getting to the hospital safe." Tasha stared at her, incredulous. "You're gonna spend your own money for a stranger?" "He's not a stranger anymore," Lila said, her voice steady. "He's someone I chose to save." The words hung in the air, simple but heavy. Outside, the ambulance lights flashed through the grimy windows, painting the walls red and blue. Lila stood, her sneakers leaving faint bloody prints on the floor. She didn't know it yet, but this choice, her reckless, stubborn, human choice, had just set her on a path that would change everything, not just for her, but for an entire city. The break room of the Rusty Anchor buzzed with tension, its flickering fluorescent light casting long shadows across the worn linoleum floor. Lila Carter stood by the sagging couch, her hands stained with Elliot Grayson's blood, her denim jacket now crumpled on the floor. The billionaire's wallet lay open beside him, its contents, a driver's license, a photo of a smiling girl, and a stack of crisp bills spilling out like secrets. Elliot's breathing was shallow, his face pale under the harsh glow, but the ambulance lights flashing through the grimy window promised help was near. Tasha paced by the door, her phone still in hand, her voice a mix of panic and disbelief. "Lila, you're telling me you're gonna pay for this guy's ride? A billionaire? Girl, you barely got enough for Jamal's meds." Lila didn't look up. Her eyes were fixed on Elliot, his chest rising and falling like a fragile metronome. The photo of his daughter, tucked behind his license, had hit her hard. It reminded her of Jamal, her little brother, whose hospital visits had drained her savings and her dreams. She knew what it was to have someone counting on you, to carry a weight no one else could see. "He's not a billionaire right now, Tasha," Lila said, her voice quiet but firm. "He's just a man who needs help." She grabbed her backpack from the corner, rummaging through it until she found her wallet, a faded canvas thing with a broken zipper. Inside was her last $50, money she'd saved for groceries. She clutched it tightly, her fingers tracing the worn edges. Tasha stopped pacing, her hands on her hips. "Lila, you're crazy. What if those guys outside are still waiting? You could have died out there, and now you're spending your own cash." "For what?" Lila met her friend's eyes, her jaw set. "For him to get home safe. For his kid to see him again." "That's enough." She turned back to Elliot, checking the gauze on his shoulder. The bleeding had slowed, but he was fading, his lips barely moving. She leaned closer, her voice soft. "Hang on, sir. We're getting you out of here." The break room door swung open as paramedics rushed in, their boots heavy on the tiles. "We've got it from here," one said, kneeling beside Elliot with a medical bag. Lila stepped back, her heart still racing, but relief washed over her like a cool breeze. The paramedics worked fast, stabilizing Elliot and lifting him onto a stretcher. Tasha hovered nearby, muttering about the chaos Lila had pulled them into. But Lila's focus was elsewhere. She slipped out to the front desk, where the neon sign of the Rusty Anchor flickered through the glass. She dialed a taxi company she trusted, one that wouldn't take advantage of a man too weak to notice. "I need a cab to Detroit General Hospital," she said, her voice steady. "I'll cover the fare." Tasha followed her, incredulous. "You're really doing this?" "You could just hand him over to the medics and be done." Lila shook her head, slipping the 50 into her pocket. "I'm not letting some shady driver swipe his wallet or overcharge him. He's been through enough." She glanced at the wallet on the couch, still open, tempting in its wealth. It would be easy to take a bill, to justify it as payment for her risk, but that wasn't who she was. She'd learned long ago that kindness wasn't about reward. It was about doing what was right, even when no one was watching. As the paramedics wheeled Elliot out, Lila followed, her sneakers leaving faint prints on the floor. The ambulance doors opened, and she handed the 50 to the taxi driver who'd just pulled up, a grizzled man with kind eyes. "Get him to the hospital, no stops," she said, her tone leaving no room for argument. "Don't charge him, he's out of it." The driver raised an eyebrow but nodded, pocketing the cash. Lila helped the paramedics transfer Elliot to the taxi, her hands gentle as she fastened his seatbelt. His eyes fluttered open, meeting hers for a moment. "You're a light," he whispered, his voice hoarse. "In the dark." Lila didn't respond. She just closed the door softly, watching as the taxi's taillights vanished into the misty Detroit night. Back inside, Lila stood by the front desk, her body heavy with exhaustion. The clock read 2:47 a.m., and the silence was deafening now that the sirens had faded. Tasha leaned against the counter, shaking her head. "You're something else, Lila Carter." Lila managed a small smile, but her thoughts were elsewhere, on the man she'd saved, on the daughter in the photo, on the choice she'd made. She didn't know it yet, but that act of pure kindness, born in a moment of chaos, had set a spark that would soon ignite a fire, not just in her life, but in the heart of a struggling city. The Rusty Anchor's lobby was quiet, save for the faint hum of the vending machine and the occasional creak of the old chandelier swaying above. It was a week since that chaotic night in Detroit, when Lila Carter had pulled a bleeding Elliot Grayson from a dark alley and paid for his taxi with her last $50. Life had settled back into its grueling rhythm, long shifts, endless bills, and the constant worry about her brother Jamal's medical costs. Lila stood behind the front desk, folding napkins for the evening rush, her braid swinging as she worked. The neon sign outside flickered, casting a dim glow through the smudged glass doors. She was lost in thought, replaying Elliot's whispered words, "You're a light in the dark," when the bell above the entrance chimed sharply. Lila glanced up, expecting another regular, maybe old Mr. Jenkins with his usual complaint about the coffee. Instead, a man stepped inside, and the air in the room seemed to shift. He was tall, his navy suit tailored to perfection, his silver-flecked hair neatly combed back. His sharp features were unmistakable, but gone was the pale, bloodied stranger from that night. Elliot Grayson stood before her, whole and commanding, his eyes bright with purpose. The lobby fell silent. Even Tasha, who was wiping down the counter, froze, her rag dangling in midair. Lila's fingers tightened around a napkin, her pulse quickening. "Mr. Grayson," she said, her voice steady but cautious. "You look better." Elliot smiled, a small, knowing curve of his lips. "Thanks to you, Miss Carter." His voice was smooth, polished, like he'd never been inches from death. He stepped closer, his polished shoes clicking on the worn tiles. "I owe you more than a thank you, and I'm here to settle that debt." Lila's brow furrowed. She wasn't used to debts being settled, not in her world, where promises were as fragile as the hotel's plumbing. "You don't owe me anything," she said, folding her arms. "I did what anyone would have done." "No," Elliot said, his tone firm but gentle. "Not anyone. I've looked into you, Lila." "You dropped out of college at 19 to care for your brother. You've worked double shifts here, covered guest damages out of your own pocket, and paid for my taxi when you could have walked away. You saved my life when no one else did." Lila's stomach twisted. He'd looked into her? The thought made her uneasy, like she was being measured for something she didn't understand. "What do you want?" she asked, her voice sharper now. Elliot reached into his coat and pulled out a slim leather folder, placing it on the counter with a soft thud. "I own the Rusty Anchor," he said, his eyes locked on hers, "and I'm giving it to you. Full ownership, no strings. It's worth millions." The words hit like a thunderclap. Tasha gasped, dropping her rag, and the few guests in the lobby turned, their whispers filling the air. Lila stared at the folder, her mind reeling. A hotel? Millions? It was absurd, impossible. Her eyes narrowed. This some kind of joke? She said, her voice low, almost a growl. Nobody gives away a hotel, especially not to a waitress in Detroit. Elliot didn't flinch. It's not a joke, it's an investment. This place is failing, bad management, worse finances, but you're the only reason it's still standing. I've seen the books, the guest reviews. You've kept it alive. I'm betting on you to make it something more. Lila's hands clenched into fists. You think you can just walk in here, throw money at me, and what? Buy my gratitude? Her voice trembled, not with fear, but with defiance. She'd fought too hard, lost too much, to be anyone's charity case. I'm not buying anything, Elliot said, his voice softening. I'm giving you what you've earned. You gave me a second chance, Lila. Let me give you one. He slid the folder closer, his gaze steady. Everything's in there. Deeds, legal papers, my lawyer's number. Take your time. Think it over. He turned to leave, pausing at the door. You don't wait for permission to do what's right. That's rare. And then he was gone, the bell chiming softly behind him. Lila stood frozen, the folder untouched on the counter. Tasha rushed over, her eyes wide. Lila, are you hearing this? A hotel! You're gonna be rich! But Lila didn't move. Her mind was a storm. Doubt, hope, fear, all colliding. She'd saved a man's life, not for reward, but because it was right. Now, that choice had dropped $1 million gift in her lap, and with it, a weight she wasn't sure she could carry. The Rusty Anchor wasn't just a building. It was a battlefield, and Lila was about to step into the fight of her life. The Rusty Anchor's office was a claustrophobic cave of chaos, its air thick with the musty scent of old paper and neglect. Lila Carter sat at a rickety desk, surrounded by stacks of dusty ledgers and invoices, her braid loose from hours of digging through the hotel's secrets. It had been 3 days since Elliot Grayson dropped a bombshell, handing her ownership of the crumbling Detroit hotel. A gift worth millions, he'd said. But as Lila pored over the books, her initial shock had curdled into unease. The numbers didn't add up. Payments to companies she'd never heard of, North Star Solutions, Atlas Ventures, appeared over and over, thousands of dollars for services that never happened. Her fingers traced a line in a ledger, $4,800 for elevator maintenance last month, but the elevator had been broken for years. This wasn't sloppy bookkeeping, it was something darker. Lila's heart thudded as she unlocked a rusted safe she'd found behind a faded painting of Lake Michigan. Inside was a leather-bound notebook, its pages filled with handwritten codes and cryptic names. One entry caught her eye. VS, transfer complete, 2mm, Cayman account. Her breath hitched. Whoever VS was, they were siphoning money through the Rusty Anchor, using the hotel as a front. She slammed the notebook shut, her mind racing. She'd taken ownership of a hotel, but it came with a hidden battlefield, one she wasn't sure she was ready to fight. The office door creaked open, and Tasha poked her head in, her eyes wide. Lila, you need to see this. Some guy's here and he's intense. Lila followed her to the lobby, where the air felt heavier, like a storm was brewing. A man stood by the front desk, his charcoal gray suit pristine, his smile sharp as a blade. He was tall, with slicked back hair and eyes that seemed to see through her. The neon sign outside cast a cold glow on his face, making him look more shadow than man. Miss Carter, he said, his voice smooth but laced with menace. I'm Victor Slade. I believe you've been exploring things that don't concern you. Lila's stomach twisted, but she held his gaze. This is my hotel now, she said, her voice steady despite the fear creeping up her spine. If something's off, it concerns me. Victor's smile widened, but it never reached his eyes. He stepped closer, his polished shoes silent on the tiles. You're a smart girl, Lila. But smart girls who dig too deep tend to find trouble. North Star Atlas, those are names you'd be wise to forget. Her blood ran cold. He knew exactly what she'd found. This wasn't a guess, it was a warning. Tasha hovered nearby, her hand inching toward the phone, but Victor's glance stopped her cold. Let me be clear, he said, leaning in, his voice dropping to a chilling whisper. You're playing with forces you can't control. This hotel, it's a small piece of a much larger game. Walk away, enjoy your little gift, and you might live long enough to spend it. Keep digging, and you're digging your own grave. Lila's fists clenched, her nails biting into her palms. She thought of Jamal, of the life she'd fought for, of the hotel she'd promised to rebuild. "You don't scare me," she said, her voice low but fierce. "I've faced worse than you." Victor chuckled, a sound like breaking glass. "Brave words. But bravery doesn't stop bullets." He turned, his coat swirling as he walked to the door. "You have one chance, Miss Carter. Don't waste it." The bell chimed as he left, and the lobby fell silent, the weight of his threat lingering like smoke. Tasha grabbed Lila's arm, her voice trembling. "Lila, who was that guy? What's going on?" Lila didn't answer right away. Her eyes were fixed on the door, where Victor's shadow had vanished into the Detroit night. She returned to the office, her hands shaking as she reopened the notebook. The codes, the payments, the initials VS, it was all connected to Victor Slade. The Rusty Anchor wasn't just a failing hotel, it was a hub for an international crime ring, laundering millions through fake invoices and offshore accounts. Lila's choice to save Elliot had thrust her into a war she hadn't asked for, but she wasn't backing down. She grabbed her phone, her fingers hovering over the screen. She needed help, someone who could shine a light on this darkness. Victor Slade thought he could scare her into silence, but he'd underestimated her. Lila Carter wasn't just a waitress anymore. She was a fighter, and she was ready to bring the fight to him. The Rusty Anchor's office felt like a war room, its cluttered desk now a battleground of papers and plans. Lila Carter sat hunched over a stack of invoices, her eyes burning from hours of cross-referencing names and numbers. The leather-bound notebook from the safe lay open, its cryptic codes pointing to Victor Slade's international crime ring, a web of fake companies laundering millions through the hotel. His chilling threat still echoed in her mind. "Keep digging, and you're digging your own grave." But Lila wasn't running. She'd saved Elliot Grayson's life, taken ownership of this crumbling Detroit hotel, and now she was going to fight for it. The neon sign outside flickered, casting jagged shadows through the window, but Lila's resolve burned brighter than any light. She grabbed her phone and dialed a number she'd found online, a journalist named Nora Hayes, known for exposing corruption in Detroit's underbelly. "Miss Hayes," Lila said when the call connected, her voice steady but urgent. "I've got evidence of money laundering at the Rusty Anchor, fake invoices, offshore accounts, and a man named Victor Slade who threatened me to stay quiet. I need someone who can make this public." Nora's reply was sharp, no nonsense. "Send me what you have. If it's real, I'll meet you tomorrow." Lila emailed scans of the notebook and invoices, her heart pounding. This was her first strike against Victor, and there was no turning back. But she couldn't do it alone. Lila called a staff meeting in the lobby, the chandelier above creaking as Tasha, Marcus, and a handful of others gathered. The air was thick with unease. "I found something," Lila began, her voice cutting through the silence. "This hotel's been used to wash money for years, and the man behind it, Victor Slade, wants us to keep quiet. I'm not going to. I'm working with a journalist to expose him, but I need your help." Marcus, the gruff maintenance worker, crossed his arms. "You're gonna get us all fired, or worse." Tasha shot him a look. "Lila saved a guy's life, Marcus." "She's not backing down, and neither am I." After a tense pause, Marcus nodded. "Fine. What do you need?" Lila laid out her plan. Install hidden cameras to catch Victor's men, who she suspected were still watching the hotel. Tasha volunteered to monitor the front desk, while Marcus rigged a cheap security camera in the loading dock. That night, they caught footage of a man in a black SUV dropping off a package, another fake invoice, Lila was sure. She sent the video to Nora, her hands shaking with adrenaline. But Victor wasn't idle. The next morning, the hotel's power cut out, plunging the lobby into darkness. A handwritten note was slipped under the door. "You can't escape." Lila's blood ran cold, but she crumpled the note and tossed it into the trash. "He's scared," she told Tasha, her voice fierce. "That means we're getting close." Nora arrived at a diner across town, her navy trench coat damp from the Detroit drizzle. She slid into the booth across from Lila, her eyes scanning the evidence. "This is bigger than I thought," Nora said, her voice low. "Slade's tied to cartels, offshore banks, even politicians. If we publish this, it'll be a bombshell." Lila leaned forward, her jaw tight. Then light the fuse. Nora nodded, promising a front-page story in the Detroit Free Press within days. Lila left the diner with a fire in her chest, but the weight of Victor's threat pressed harder. Back at the hotel, she found Marcus fixing the power, his face grim. "This wasn't an accident," he said. "Someone cut the lines." Lila gathered the staff again, her voice ringing with defiance. "Slade thinks he can bully us into silence." "He's wrong. We're not just employees, we're family, and we're taking this place back." Tasha clapped, and Marcus, for the first time, smiled. The cameras kept rolling, catching another of Victor's men skulking near the hotel. Lila sent every frame to Nora, building a case that couldn't be ignored. She was no longer just a waitress. She was a warrior, rallying her team against a giant. As she locked the office that night, the neon sign outside flickered, but to Lila, it felt like a beacon, signaling the fight was far from over. The Rusty Anchor's lobby was alive with a nervous energy, the air buzzing like a storm about to break. Lila Carter stood at the front desk, her hands gripping a crumpled copy of the Detroit Free Press. The headline screamed in bold black letters, "Detroit Hotel exposed as hub of international money-laundering scheme." Nora Hayes hadn't held back. Her article laid bare Victor Slade's web of fake companies, North Star Solutions, Atlas Ventures, detailing millions funneled through the Rusty Anchor to offshore accounts. Lila's hidden camera footage, the cryptic notebook from the safe, and her own testimony were woven into the story, a bombshell that had Detroit talking. Outside, the neon sign flickered, but inside, Lila felt a fire growing, a fire she'd sparked and now had to tend. The morning the article dropped, the hotel was quiet, too quiet, like the city was holding its breath. Lila stood by the window, watching the street. Tasha was at the counter, nervously tapping her pen, while Marcus lingered near the door, his toolbox forgotten. They'd all seen the article, and they knew what it meant. Victor Slade wasn't a man who'd fade quietly. But before fear could settle, tires screeched outside. Two black SUVs pulled up, their doors flying open as FBI agents in dark vests spilled out, badges flashing. Lila's heart leaped. She stepped outside, her braids swinging as an agent approached. "Miss Carter, we're here about the evidence you provided." "We've got warrants for Slade's associates." Lila nodded, her voice steady. "They're all yours." From a distance, she watched as agents stormed a nearby warehouse, one of Victor's drop points, caught on her cameras. Handcuffs clicked, voices shouted, and two men in suits were led out, their faces grim. Victor wasn't among them, but Lila knew this was a blow he couldn't ignore. The staff gathered in the lobby, their eyes wide with a mix of awe and relief. Tasha hugged Lila, her voice breaking. "You did it, girl. You actually did it." Marcus, usually stoic, clapped her shoulder. "Didn't think you had this in you, Carter." Lila smiled, but her thoughts were on the hotel. This victory wasn't just about exposing Slade, it was about giving the Rusty Anchor a new life. That afternoon, Lila called a community meeting in the parking lot. The old hotel sign, rusted and faded, loomed above as neighbors, staff, and even strangers drawn by the news gathered. Lila stood on a makeshift platform, her hands steady despite the weight of every eye on her. "This place," she began, her voice clear and strong, "was used to hide lies, to steal from our city, but we're done hiding. We're not just rebuilding a hotel, we're rebuilding trust. This is our home, our fight, and our future." She paused, her gaze sweeping the crowd. "Today we start fresh. Welcome to the Beacon." She gave a nod, and Marcus and Tasha pulled a canvas sheet from the new sign. Brushed bronze letters gleamed in the sunlight. The Beacon, a light for all. The crowd erupted in cheers, not wild, but heartfelt, the kind of applause that came from shared struggle. Children waved homemade signs, and an old woman from the corner store wiped her eyes. Lila stepped down, her throat tight. Tasha grabbed her hand, whispering, "You're making history, Lila." Lila shook her head. "We're making it together." The FBI raid had cracked Victor's empire, and the Beacon stood as a symbol of defiance. A place that had been a front for crime now reborn as a haven. Lila walked back inside, the lobby feeling different, lighter, like the walls themselves had exhaled. The chandelier above gleamed, freshly polished, and the air smelled of lemon and hope. She knew Victor was still out there, his shadow looming, but for now, she'd won. The Beacon wasn't just a hotel anymore. It was a promise, a light in Detroit's darkness, and Lila Carter was its keeper. The Beacon stood proud under the Detroit sky, its new bronze sign gleaming like a promise kept. Weeks had passed since Lila Carter's fight turned the rusty anchor from a front for Victor Slade's crimes into a symbol of hope. The lobby, once dim and dusty, now hummed with life. Fresh paint coated the walls and framed photos of Detroit's landmarks, vibrant murals, the riverfront, hung where peeling wallpaper once sagged. The old chandelier sparkled, casting warm light on guests and neighbors who lingered, drawn by something more than a place to stay. Lila stood by the front desk, her braid neat, her eyes bright with a quiet pride. The hotel wasn't just reborn, it was transforming the city around it. The Beacon had become a community hub, a place where people found more than a room. On Monday evenings, locals gathered for free job training classes in the dining hall, learning skills from bartending to bookkeeping. Kids from the block, their backpacks slung low, crowded the lobby after school for a reading program Lila had started, their laughter echoing off the polished floors. Tasha, now the unofficial morale booster, handed out snacks, while Marcus, once skeptical, taught basic repairs to teens eager to fix their own bikes. The neighborhood was changing, not with grand gestures, but with small, steady steps. Lila saw it in the way old Mr. Jenkins smiled now, or how Ms. Clara from the bodega next door brought over homemade tamales to share. Lila's vision didn't stop at the hotel's walls. She'd launched the Beacon Future Scholarship, funded partly by Elliot Grayson, who'd quietly wired a donation after the FBI raid. The fund aimed to send Detroit kids to college, especially those like her brother, Jamal, who'd faced too many closed doors. The first recipient, a shy 17-year-old named Keisha, had cried when Lila handed her the award letter, promising to study nursing. "You gave me a chance," Keisha said, hugging Lila tight. Lila's throat tightened, thinking of her own dreams, deferred but never forgotten. She wasn't just building a hotel, she was building futures. Word of the Beacon's work spread far beyond Detroit. A national news crew arrived one crisp morning, their cameras capturing the lobby's glow and the kids reading in cozy corners. The anchor, a woman with a warm smile, interviewed Lila in the dining hall. "You're being called the woman who lit up Detroit," she said, her voice carrying across the room. Lila laughed, shaking her head. "It's not just me. It's Tasha, Marcus, the kids, the neighbors. We did this together." That night, the segment aired on primetime, and Lila's phone buzzed with messages from strangers across the country, calling the Beacon a model for change. A retired teacher in Ohio sent a check for the scholarship fund. A chef in Atlanta offered to teach a cooking class. The Beacon wasn't just a local story anymore. It was a spark igniting hope nationwide. But Lila stayed grounded. She walked the halls each evening, checking on guests, chatting with staff, ensuring the Beacon lived up to its name. One night, she found Keisha in the lobby, studying under a lamp. "Miss Carter," Keisha said, her voice soft. "I want to be like you someday." "You don't give up." Lila smiled, her chest warm. "You already are, Keisha. Just keep going." She thought of Jamal, now stronger, and of the night she'd saved Elliot, a choice that had led her here. The Beacon was more than a hotel. It was a legacy, proof that one act of courage could ripple outward, touching lives she'd never imagined. As Lila locked the front doors that night, the bronze sign outside shone steady. No flicker, no fade. The Detroit streets were still rough, still scarred, but the Beacon stood as a light for all who needed it. Lila knew challenges lay ahead. Victor Slade's shadow lingered, and the work was never done. But she was ready. The legacy she was building wasn't just for her or for Detroit. It was for anyone who believed in second chances, in the power of community, in the strength to rise from ashes. The Beacon's light would burn on, steady and unshakable, a testament to what courage could create. The Beacon stood tall under the twilight sky, its bronze sign glowing like a lighthouse in the heart of Detroit. The streets around it, once silent and scarred, now buzzed with a quiet hope. Lila Carter leaned against the front desk, her braids slightly undone after a long day, her eyes tracing the lobby's transformation. The walls, now painted a warm ivory, held photos of local kids graduating from the Beacon's job training classes. The chandelier above sparkled, no longer creaking, its light dancing on the polished floors. Outside, neighbors lingered on the steps, sharing stories over coffee, while kids laughed, chasing fireflies in the parking lot. The Beacon wasn't just a hotel anymore. It was a home, a haven, a testament to what courage and kindness could build. Lila walked to the dining hall, where the last job training class of the day was wrapping up. A young man named Darius, barely 18, stood at a makeshift bar, practicing a mocktail recipe with a shy grin. Lila paused, watching him pour with care, his hands steadier than they'd been a month ago. "You're getting good, Darius," she said, her voice warm. He looked up, his smile widening. "Thanks to you, Miss Carter. You gave me a shot when no one else did." Lila's chest tightened. She thought of that night in the alley, when she'd risked everything to save Elliot Grayson, not for reward, but because it was right. That single act of kindness had sparked a chain reaction, turning a crumbling hotel into a beacon of hope. She stepped outside, the cool evening air brushing her face. The bronze sign, the beacon, a light for all, shone steady, no flicker, no fade. Lila's journey hadn't been easy. She'd faced Victor Slade's threats, uncovered his crimes, and rallied a community to rebuild what was broken. The FBI raid had shaken his empire, and her work with Nora Hayes had lit a fire that spread across the country. But it was the small moments, like Darius's smile, or the way Ms. Clara from the bodega now called the Beacon our place, that meant the most. Lila had learned something profound. One small act of kindness could ripple outward, changing lives, even cities, in ways no one could predict. As she stood under the sign, Lila felt the weight of her choices. She'd been a waitress, a sister, a fighter, and now, a leader. The Beacon was her legacy, but it belonged to everyone who'd believed in it. Tasha, Marcus, the kids, the neighbors. She pulled out her phone, opening a note she'd written weeks ago. "Keep the light burning. For Jamal. For Detroit. For anyone who needs it." She smiled, tucking the phone away. The lesson was clear. Do what's right, even when no one's watching, even when it's hard. A single choice, made with heart, could light up the darkest corners of the world. Lila turned back to the lobby, where Tasha was hanging a new photo, a group shot from the first Beacon Future Scholarship ceremony. "You're gonna need a bigger wall soon," Tasha teased, her eyes bright. Lila laughed, the sound light and free. The Beacon was more than a building now. It was a promise that hope could grow anywhere, even in a city as tough as Detroit. She thought of her brother, Jamal, now dreaming of college, and of the strangers across the country who'd sent letters, inspired by the Beacon's story. And so, to everyone watching, here's the truth Lila learned. One act of courage, one moment of kindness, can change everything. It doesn't take money or power, just a heart that refuses to look away. If Lila's story moves you, hit that like button, share this video, and tell us in the comments, what light will you spark in your corner of the world? Maybe there's someone near you, right now, watching this story, ready to make a difference. The Beacon's light is burning bright, and it's calling you to keep it alive. Do what's right, be the light, and together we can make the world a little brighter, one choice at a time.